GIS for execs and analysts, using dashboards to tell a compelling story. That was the title that I've ended up with. I didn't quite start there, in fact, because I had originally called it From Paper to Digital and Beyond the Boundaries, Understanding Property Value and Affordability in New Zealand. But a little bit like, Dr. Strangelove and How I Learned to Love the Bomb, the title felt not to be quite appropriate. So, but anyway, discussion topics. So first of all, I'm going to go through CoreLogic at a glance, so a little bit about us. Then I'll talk a little bit about the problem statement, which was really around the paper report. Then we'll talk about the three pillars of the dashboard, the data pillars. They are buyer classification, mortgage market share, and the automated valuation model, or AVM data, which is probably my favourite out of the three, if I was going to have a data favourite. And then the digital report itself, and then I'm going to brave a demo, and I say brave the demo because the internet is running off the phone in my pocket, off a development server in New Zealand. So we'll see how we go there. It'll be fine. So CoreLogic at a glance, who are we? So CoreLogic's a multinational organisation based out of Irvine in California in the United States. We've got operations in about 8 countries. It's about 6,000 plus employees. We've got about $1.9 billion worth of revenue coming through, invest about $75 million. And our principal business is really around property intelligence and risk management and solutions, underwriting and workflow solutions, although the latter of the two there at the bottom, they don't really apply so much to the New Zealand and Australian businesses. All right, here's our footprint. This is where we are. So, as you can see, in the US, we've got an office in the UK there as well, and Australia and New Zealand with relationships in various countries around the world. Now, property. So property is our biggest asset in almost every country, I suspect. In New Zealand, it's worth about $1.1 trillion. And compared to the other metrics up there, are really just there for comparison's sake. So we've got about $90 billion in New Zealand invested in our super. We've got about $138 billion worth of New Zealand listed stocks and about $204 billion worth of commercial property and industrial real estate. There's about 1.4 million dwellings in New Zealand. There's about $257 billion worth of outstanding debt. 55% of our wealth is in household, is held in housing, etc. In Australia, those numbers all jump significantly. In fact, there's no billions anymore. We're well and truly into trillions. There's about $7.6 trillion in real estate property value in Australia, 10 million dwellings, about $1.75 trillion worth of outstanding debt. So that outstanding debt in Australia alone is equivalent to our total value of our property in New Zealand. The paper report, so the problem statement, and this is where we came from. So our client, and the reason I call it a problem statement is because our client, when we talked to them about the paper reports that we'd been supplying them for quite a while, they kind of said, well, it was great, but they weren't really using it, and that's not a good thing. The paper reports that we had created, we created them in Tableau. They were about 30 pages long. They PDF reports were reasonably detailed in the urban centres, the big urban centres like Auckland, Wellington, Christchurch, etc. But that we couldn't really get down to much more detail in some of the smaller areas where there was actually a lot of activity in the housing market. So they were sort of left out. Reporting was only able to be done in specific time slices, so we were sort of stuck to 3 months or 3 years, and so that didn't really allow a lot of analytics, for the bank. They could kind of see those things and say that's great, but it didn't actually allow them to get very deep into the data. The biggest problem was that it ended up in a trash bin. So a lot of people weren't actually using it. They kind of got these things delivered to their desks, and then they didn't really know how to understand that information or work with that information, so they just kind of never really used it. And that's when the bank approached us and actually said to us that they were probably going to discontinue this, which was about $120,000 worth of revenue for us per year. So we thought, well, we might be able to fix that. And so we began to look at ways that we could probably, change the way that we approach this. And this is where Esri Technologies really stepped in and helped us to come up with something that's really compelling. Here's another view of those paper reports. This is the detailed view. So, if this is as detailed as it gets, you can see where the problem is already. And this is a pretty standard map view, right, from Tableau. We've got the size of the circle represents like how many mortgages there are, and then the colour actually represents how many, what percentage that particular bank had. So the data that goes into that by classification. So in about 2013, New Zealand introduced loan to value ratio restrictions, and that was really to kind of put a bit of a buffer between their risk by lending money and the banks that they were borrowing from in the face of anything like a sharp downturn. And this was really a reaction to the GFC in 2008, the global financial crisis. The effect LVR, though, would have was a bit of an unknown. So what we really needed to do was start to analyse and predict as much as we could what might actually be happening if we introduced this mechanism. And we were particularly worried about first home buyers. So we started to categorise them. As we began classifying those guys, we invariably end up classifying all the rest of the buyer types. And, over on the side, on the right-hand side there, you can see the classifications. The current state of it is that if you want to buy a property and you're an investor, you've got about a 35% deposit required. If you're an owner-occupier, so just you buying a home, then you've got to put in about 20% deposit, which is quite a lot higher than what it used to be. The data goes back about 15 years, the data that we use, but however, it actually goes back a lot longer than that. If we talk about some of those classifications, so first home buyers, that's pretty obvious. It's someone who's buying their first home. Movers, slightly more complex. They are someone who's bought a home or a property, and then within a 6-month period, they've sold that and then they've bought another house. Multiple property owners, that's pretty obvious. They own one or more properties, 2 or more properties. Re-entry to market, so these tend to be the people that have owned a property, they've then sold that property, they've probably gone overseas or they've done something, just got out of the market for a while, then they're coming back into the market and buying a new house. And new to market, this is a slightly complex one. It tends to be foreign buyers or big buyers coming in and buying up more than one property or something like that. And then you'll notice on the right-hand side, right down the bottom here, we've got refinance. Now, it's less of a buyer classification, and it is actually it applies to all of those classifications, but we can sort of see when people are refinancing, and that's particularly interesting to the banks as well, how often that's happening, where that's happening. Mortgage market share. So mortgage market share data is reasonably self-explanatory. It's based on who owns that, who is the incumbent mortgagee, and that's recorded by the government at the point of the title transfer to the new owner of the property. CoreLogic New Zealand, we take that title information and we then look at those and we aggregate them to form property boundaries, because you can have more than one title or more than one parcel for a property. We then aggregate the mortgages into their banks, so we aggregate them into the top 5 banks in New Zealand, which is sort of Kiwi Bank, ASB, which is CommBank here, Westpac, and BNZ, and one other one. And then with that bank information, then we utilise that information to analyse their mortgage performance relative to the other competitors. We also aggregate a whole bunch into the tier 2, so those are your slightly smaller banks, HSBCs, Rabobank, etc. And then we've got millions of mortgage lenders, and so we kind of all lump them into other. And again, there's about 15 years worth of data. AVM data. So AVM data is automated valuation model data, and so the AVM is produced by using machine learning technologies, and what it's doing is it's looking at a whole lot of variable information, such as bath and bedrooms, or bathrooms and bedrooms, rateable value, sales history, location, property categories, number of floor areas, land area, and things like that. But it's a very, very complex data set, and it's actually one that's actually quite hard to visualize as well for a number of reasons. One is that we can't display it one-to-one very easily, because if we display it to the public at one-to-one, they've got two complaints generally. One, that the value isn't high enough and that they believe their property is worth more than that. Or secondly, that when they're buying a home, the value is too high, and they don't like that either. So the second thing that we need to do is to get around that is we need to generalise that information. It creates quite a compelling graphic. So what we do is we've taken an approach which aggregates property values within a GSD, within a ground sample distance, and then we've kind of done that for scale. So if we're at the scale of something like 1,128, your sort of standard Bing, Google, Esri scales, then we're sort of looking at about 100 metres squared. If we're going up, then we're looking at about 200 metres squared for the next one, 400 metres squared for the levels up above that. And so the squares just get bigger and bigger and bigger as we go out, as we zoom out. And we can then zoom in. And that's a really nice way of visualising it. It's kind of like a heat map, but you can kind of interrogate it a bit better. And it also provides much greater insight into property value. So what we tend to do is when we generalise data traditionally for AVM data, we aggregate it all the way up to a higher geography like suburbs or statistical area units, and that really doesn't give a great impression of actually what's happening within a suburb and where value is concentrated within a suburb. So we need to kind of look at it in a slightly more granular level, and that's where AVM data visualised this way and used this way is actually really, really powerful. And it's something that really has appealed hugely to some of our clients, as well as to be able to see this, because if they can sit down with frontline mobile lenders and things like that, they can actually talk about value within a neighbourhood. One of the other things I think that's interesting about AVM data is that it shows where the value is, and you can probably easily see a lot of the reasons for that value. So if you see along coastal properties and things like that, they've got a big tick, and it's not often clear when you're just looking at it aggregated to a suburb level. It's really nice to be able to look at the school, and you can see that property values around that school are actually higher, and you can actually add some sense to that. They're higher because they're around a good school. So digital reporting, the banking dashboard, and this is where we sort of moved to. So once we sort of thought, well, the paper reports, they're not doing it for our client, and we need to come up with a better solution, we go for something else. And what we elected to do is take this sort of path of least resistance. We couldn't go and invent something massively new and invest a lot of money in creating a whole new application or whatever to try and fix that problem. But Esri's tools, Web App Builder and things like that, really allows us to create something very, very compelling, but with actually a sort of following a path of least resistance type development framework. So we built it using Esri's Web App Builder. Uses the same data, points to the exact same tables that are in the database that were being used to produce the paper reports. The great things about it, the metrics are dynamic. They're presented using standard map navigation tools, so as you pan around, zoom in, zoom out, you're actually getting a lot more information than you ever could out of the paper reports. The other thing that does is it means that you're looking at a map extent rather than a suburb or one of those higher geographies. You're actually just kind of able to kind of see the value and affordability within the extent. Temporal information can be filtered, so the dates, we can filter on dates and we can filter on a bunch of other stuff, but that ability to kind of not restrict themselves to 3 months or 3 years or 1 year or whatever, they can actually now dial in whatever sort of time frame that they're interested in and actually pull up analytics for that as well. The filters now in Web App Builder are all cascade, so it's kind of like the old reselect in Arc. You can select one thing, that's your first filter, and then you can reselect against that filter, and then you can reselect against that filter. So that allows the client really to hone in on specifically what they're looking at, especially when they're looking at their own performance. And it's largely out of the box, and so we didn't have to invest a lot of time in developing the solution. It was just reconfiguring it and linking it up. We did add in a graph to display trend data, which was kind of the missing piece, and I'm sure that'll come in time out of the box as well. And of course we added in a bank logo and an additional widget kind of space for a widget to go in. And so with that, I'm now going to brave the demo. What we've got is we've got a pretty simple interface. What we can do is just pan around and zoom in, and what you'll see down the bottom of the screen there is the metrics actually automatically change. So your typical dashboard behaviour type stuff. Where it's really useful for the banks though is that they can actually see, just by zooming in, and they're sort of getting away from that concept of suburbs. They can actually now start to look at things and affordability and property values and their performance and the market without actually having to say, oh, what's happening in one particular suburb. So it's actually getting away from that idea of trying to aggregate all this information up. What we've got down the bottom here, so we've got the buyer classification, that just got the straight count, and at the moment it's set for all time, so all data. And then we've got our performance mortgage market share, so that's how the banks are all performing relative to each other in this particular very expensive part of Auckland and New Zealand. And then we've got some just simple metrics around the average property size, the average floor size, and the average build year. Over this side also, we've got this value by suburb, and now while I'm sort of saying I don't think we should really think about these things in terms of suburbs, what this is actually doing is it's just looking at the part of the suburb that you've got on the screen. So as I kind of zoom, where's my mouse gone now? There we go. As I move, we can see now that only those portions of those suburbs appear within this. So we're still thinking in terms of extents, we're not really thinking in terms of suburbs, but we can see to the value of those suburbs within that particular extent. What we're also seeing here, so the two breakups there between the red and the grey, so the red is the land value and the grey is how much they've invested on top of that. So you can see where people are over-capitalising in properties or where they're under-capitalising in property as well. Up the top, so we've got some the simple, just sort of standard Esri out of the box widgets. We've got the layer list, which has at the moment one layer in it, which is our AVM layer, and would have our clients' branches and things in there as well, but we have to remove those. We've got the legend, which relates back to that. Base map selector. We've also got an average market value, so that just looks at the land value, CV and LV of a particular area and a ticker tape, but it can be a little bit slow sometimes coming up. We've also, there we go. So that's the capital value, the average land value and the average improvements value. The other thing we've got is, and this is a customized widget, so this is one that we actually developed to extend the functionality, and this is around the trend data. And so this is how all those banks have performed over all time, so from 2005 to 2018 within that, and you can see, who's doing well and who's doing not, when they came into the market and when they stopped being in the market there. And I'll come back to that a little bit more when we get to these filters. And the filters is really where all the power is in this application, the thing that really allows them to get into that analysis side of things. So if we start looking at the dates, we can say, all right, let's go back to a particular date and time. Let's go back to something like April 1st, and then say through to today. And then we turn that on, and the first thing that should happen is all those metrics change down the bottom. So now we're just looking at information within that time frame. So within this particular geographic extent, that's how these banks have performed relative to each other within that particular time frame. All of these other metrics too, they're all affected by that. So these 293, that's actually the properties that they've sold, the transactions, the total transactions that have happened within that time. All of these metrics are related to just those properties rather than everything that we've got on the screen there. And we can continue down, so now we can go through the buyer classifications. We can say let's just look at first home buyers and multiple property owners. We can take them out and go back to the buyer classification. So now we're just going to see those two metrics. And so, but they're cascading, and this is something which is really great. It's coming, one selection drives the other, so as I turn off that date, everything changes with it. So, and it's the same as we go through the rest of them. We could just say we just are particularly interested in the top 5 banks. So we'll go through those. Turn those on. And now we're only looking at those banks within that extent. And you get the drift here. And the last one is sort of property type. So that allows us to filter out apartments, actual family homes, and lifestyle blocks and things like that. The real story, though, for us, I think, out of all of this has just been, we've taken something which was a problem. They were going to take, they loved the data and they loved the information, but they didn't like the way that they were being delivered that information, repackaging it and putting it in something like this. And it made it really, really straightforward for people to be able to see, that's massive floor area. They managed to sort of see a bit more, they could actually really get in there and start to analyse this information in a much more meaningful way, rather than just kind of being sort of force-fed these things in metrics and that we felt were important to them rather than them. So from the point of view of them being able to sort of do self-service analysis, this has been a really empowering tool. The message for us is that following a path of least resistance towards developing it, harnessing the technology that's already being developed for us, that's great. We didn't invest a huge amount of money going from paper reports to a full-fledged application and something that they were really excited about. We just rewired a few things and made a few small changes, and we got a really successful outcome. And that's it. Thank you very much.